Let's start with typical statements on presenting the environment in a securitized manner. I think we are familiar with those kind of statements. Larry presented many of those. And it seems to me that for the last 10 years, the environmental discourse has become saturated with security jargon. Why do we do so? What are the potential connection between scarcity of the environment and security issues? There are three different rationales for connecting the environment and security. The first one, the most basic one, it's a typical Homer-Dixon argument that would argue that there is an environmental event which can be either a scarcity, a gap between demand and supply, or it can be an abundance. We have too much of a certain resource. There is nowadays the literature on resource curse that can trigger conflicts, and conflicts can escalate into a security issue. That has been around for at least 20 years. A different argument, a different rationale would be, or has to do with security, with the environmental footprint of security measures. Think of a defense wall that has an environmental impact that can again cause or trigger scarcity, and then the same causality, how scarcity ends in a security issue. And the third one is different. Here we start thinking with the environmental threat. Think on a potential drought, flood. We need to build a desal plant. Countries bond together. It's a trigger for collective action, which can be a peace-building measure, which is a dimension of security. And again, we are familiar with the literature on the environment as a platform for peace. Okay, so there are some potential rationales for linking the environment with security. What resources we are likely to securitize? The first, I would say the most straightforward one is energy, the concept of energy security. If you review the literature, it has been around since the mid-70s, after the oil embargo. One potential definition of energy security: reliable and adequate supply at a reasonable price. Quite often, our concern is reliable supply. A stable climate of maintaining a rate of change below the dangerous level for human and ecological systems. And here we securitize our life support systems, our resistance. And finally, there is the notion of food security, which again started during the mid-70s as a result of a rise in the price of food. At the beginning also we securitized reliable supply, then came health and health considerations, and nowadays we are discussing food in terms of entitlements, rights, we are securing values. Water has gone a similar process, and nowadays we are discussing water as a basic right. Let's keep it one. And Larry spoke about the holy nexus, securitizing the connection between energy, water, food, climate, whatever. Let's keep that. Let's start with that table, which I think is the core of my research. How can we identify a securitized discourse or process when we see one? What are the indicators, the measurable ones, that we need to look in a securitized process? So we reviewed the literature, including the Copenhagen School literature, and we did at the same time 3 case studies, and we tried to adjust the general literature into water and energy. Let me go over it. We argue that there are 2 component attributes that can make the decision a securitized one. It can be either a linguistic attribute, or it can be an institutional attribute, and I will give, of course, examples. And you can see the different components, which can be discourse, issue framing, water centrality, and so on and so forth, and how a process would look like in a technical process, in a technical decision-making process, In a politicized one, we made a distinction between a politicized and a securitized one. It's not the same. And some of the mechanisms that we can use to operationalize a discourse or a process from a political into a securitized one. Now let me give you a few examples. Let's start with the discourse and issue framing. When we discuss issues in a technical manner, we would be very much technical discussions about water, flows, quality, and quantity. And also the issue would be framed around a problem, maybe a risk. When we spill into a politicized and especially a securitized one, the problem will be presented in an existential manner. I'll give you a concrete example. We've been working on the Israeli-Palestinian water negotiation, one of our case studies, and you could see during one of the negotiation events, Condoleezza Rice said, is there a shortage of water? And the Palestinian negotiator said, there is a disaster, there is a great shortage. During the same event, the Palestinian negotiator said, in response to an Israeli demand to reduce the water allocation, that it is like the man who is 220 centimeters tall and the door is less. I could ask him to bend, or I can ask him that we cut his neck. So you could see the language, the existential language, as an indicator for us for a securitized discourse. So they're not discussing problems or risks, they put it in a very existential manner. So that's one possible indicator. Let's move to water centrality. And we argue that when you discuss water or energy, it can be either primary, water is the main issue or energy is the main issue, but when we move into a securitized, water unfortunately becomes secondary. I will give you an example. That's an example for primary, water at the center. That's from the Zambezi Water Course Commission, and its aim is to address emerging situations resulting from SATER, either from natural causes or from human conduct, causing an imminent threat to the water course. Water is at the center. It's the primary object. When we move to secondary, again, from the Israeli-Palestinian ongoing water negotiation, and the Israeli negotiator said, providing Gaza with water and power is not difficult, they need to stop the rockets. So water is not at the center. It's traditional security which is at the center, and it is linked to water issues. Another example from the Iran-Iraq Water Treaty. The motivation for the agreement is considering their desire to restore security and mutual trust. Again, at the center is traditional security, and water is a mechanism as a tool to implement or to build trust. More indicators. Another one is what we call rule observance. It can be either compliant under a technical process or rule defiance under a securitized one. Compliant means that we accept the rules of the game, the existing institutions. When we move to a securitized, it means that we need new rule game, new rules for the game, new institutions, new decisions. Finally, or almost finally, there is transparency, and we expect it to be higher in a technical process and lower in a securitized one. And efficiency, we expect it to be higher in a technical process and lower in a securitized one, and the mechanism would be probably rejecting benefit cost analysis. To give you an example, for efficiency considerations, the water agreement between Czech and the Slovak Republic, and you can see from the language the interest of the harmonious development and prosperity of agriculture, food industry, forestry, whatever, as opposed to the other considerations, that is from terms of reference for doing a feasibility study of a water convenience project between Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians. And you could see from the TOR that one of the aims is with a view to increase the prospects for peace, security, and prosperity in the region. So as you can see, there isn't much efficiency. It is mostly the so-called, whatever it is, the peace dividends. Okay, I skipped one. And finally, there is equity considerations which I expected to be lower in a technical discourse and maybe higher in a securitized one, but I'm not really sure about it. Why are we securitizing? I think Larry spoke about it. It's a great tool, or allegedly a great tool to get attention. There is another argument that has to do with obsolete institutions that used to be engaged in traditional security. Now they are doing environmental restoration. Think of the Corps of Engineers, and they need to reframe their activities, and they are still using the historical, the previous framing, which is security. And maybe it's a genuine fear of political instability. What does it mean to securitize? Already know that. It makes decisions on the basis of impulse, urgency, and mostly the rationale for decisions is not a benefit-cost analysis. It is urgency. Is it good or bad? I'm not sure I can tell you much about that. The argument that it puts the environment on the agenda. And quite often in the climate literature, we would see the argument that unless we connect climate to economics and political issues, no one will pay attention to it. What is the dark side of securitization? That's the big question. Does it have a dark side or a positive side? We reviewed the literature and we made one main argument that we tried to follow during our 3 case studies. The argument is that it negates prioritization because all issues can become securitized. What do I mean by that? Take any resource like land. Land can be allocated for nature conservation, for food production, for solar farming, whatever. And imagine one player who is using the securitization framework to get an edge in negotiations. What do you think the other players would do? They would definitely do the same. Then we might end up in what we call competing securities. How can policymakers not prioritize between competing securities? All of them are urgent. All of them are prioritized. Benefit-cost analysis is not relevant. So the argument that we are trying to make is that competing securities will cause a gridlock. And indeed, during the beginning of the 90s, there were a few papers, environmental security skeptics. They speculated on the dark side of securitization. Here are the papers. All of them are great papers, but they are not very much based on empirical studies. Having this in mind, we came up with 6 generic questions which we tried to address. The first one is, what resources are we securitizing? Is it energy, water, coastal, fishery, whatever? I don't know. Who is securitizing the environmental discourse? Is it more states, NGOs, international organizations? How do we securitize? What are the linguistic and institutional tools for operationalizing it? Next, what variables encourage securitization, scarcity, political ones, conflict, social ones? We are not sure. What are the implications which I already mentioned? And if indeed there is a competition between securities and it causes a gridlock, how can we reconcile between competing securities? 6 generic questions, and let me move very quickly to 3 case studies. The first one we already completed. We did it several years ago. It deals with the UN Commission for Sustainable Development. We are familiar with that forum, very high-profile forum, which was set during the 90s after the Brundtland report in order to implement Agenda 21. Parties, they meet once a year. Each year they discuss a different topic. It can be water, energy, climate, deforestation, whatever. And we build a database of statements that deals with water and energy. And we review them and we try to identify which one of them is more securitized than the other. And then do some basic statistics and try to identify what are the variables that may encourage a more securitized statement than the other. You could see our database. We gathered 366 statements that relate to water and twice as much statements that relates to energy. We picked up energy and water because we suspected that there is a chance that players will securitize their discourse. Next, we had to look for a very blunt indicator because we couldn't review 1,000 statements. It would take us ages. So we looked for an indicator that would indicate that there is a potential for the statement to be securitized. So we looked for the word, reference to the word security. It's a very blunt indicator, but since we wanted to do some statistics, we had to end up in such a blunt indicator. So as you could see, about 20% of the statements that relates to water, and the same for energy, reference the word security. And then we had to, unfortunately, we had to read those statements. Some results that we got. You could see the distribution between state security, which puts the state at the center, and human security, which deals with vulnerable communities. This is the results for water. And we're securitizing states versus non-states. And as you can see, it is mostly, or water is being treated as a human security issue. In some cases, we couldn't decide what it is, human or state security. And you could see that it is mostly non-states which present water as a human security issue. Not surprising. What are they securitizing? Because one criteria to decide whether it is a genuine securitization and not just a buzzword is to see if there is a genuine threat, a reference object. As to water, quite often they securitize issues of supply, food security, land ownership, and in some cases we couldn't find any real threat in water. When you move to energy, the picture is different. Here you would see that mostly the concern was state security. In some cases were human security, but in most cases we couldn't identify a genuine threat. Why are they discussing or using such jargon? But what are they securitizing? It's quite similar: reliable supply, food security. It's not much different. To give you an example of a securitized statement made by Sweden, addressing political unrest caused by a sharp increase in oil prices. What encourages securitization? So we did some statistics. We came up with a bunch of variables. Those that deal with scarcity, conflict, GDP, percentage of population in the agricultural sector, and so on. We did the same for energy. Let's see what came out. When we look at energy, none of the variables came up statistically significant. We got garbage, which was terrible in terms of potential propagation. Then we move to water. Unfortunately, maybe as well still garbage, but at least significant garbage. So two results or two indicators, two variables came out significant. One is the percentage of population employed in the agricultural sector, and the other one is the percentage of water that a country uses that comes outside its boundaries, which makes sense, two variables that represent vulnerability. So that was the first exercise. Let's move to the second one, which is more challenging. And I think we were more mature, more academically mature for doing it, which deals with competition between securitized discourses and what may encourage it. And we decided to work on energy and on solar farms in the Israeli desert. So it doesn't really have an explicit transboundary dimension. We conceptualize it first. So we suspect it to start with resource scarcity, and probably an event which exacerbates resource scarcity. And again, the same resource which is scarce can be used for example, land, for various activities, solar farms, army training, ecological reserves, and so on. And the moment that there is competition, each player is looking for an edge in negotiation, and it would create competition over agenda setting. But before turning into securitization, there is a need for the right climate, for enabling conditions, and that could be a disaster or a conflict which would politicize the decision-making process. And we think that a politicized decision-making process would be more receptive for competing security discourses. So that's how we started, by a bit conceptualizing and reviewing the literature. Let's go to the case study. Nowadays in the Israeli desert, there is a rush towards solar farms. Over than 100 plans submitted to the planning committees for building solar farms. All of them consume a large amount of land which is scarce. And indeed, land is scarce. Most of it is being used by the Israeli army for training. The rest is used for ecological needs. And there is also food requirement, which consumes about 8% of the land. And now comes a new player, the energy sector, who wants its own share for solar farms. So how does it work? How do we suspect it to work? Again, appropriated and scarce land. The energy sector comes in, they want their share. They may approach the securitization framing, but before doing so, there are some triggering events, enabling conditions that may encourage or discourage them from using the security framing. And these can be geostrategic events. For example, there is a pipeline, gas pipeline between Israel and Egypt. Quite often it is being sabotaged. So we hypothesize that when it is sabotaged, it would encourage the energy sector to use security framing. Another potential triggering event could be regulatory events. In solar farms, you need to set up the feed-in tariff, the subsidies. So we hypothesize that when it is about to be adjusted, the feed-in tariff, again, the energy sector would be encouraged to use such language. And finally, there are offshore gas discoveries along the Israeli coast, and we suspect that when we have those, it would discourage the energy sector for using such a language. And if the energy sector is making use of such language, the food industry and the food sector would use a similar language, and the same for the environmental sector, and the army, of course, would not be left behind, and the climate one, and everyone would be using the same bombastic jargon. And we end up in competing security discourses. Of course, we have to back it up now by research. And finally, there is another element, which is institutional setting. And we hypothesize that in political venues, we are likely to get more competition between securities. Are we doing how much time have left? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, the database, we gathered 84 protocols that document the discourse and the discussions over solar farms, and we identified almost 200 securitized statements. To give you a few examples, the energy or the army would argue in one particular protocol there is a need to allocate more training areas to the army to accommodate the security threat. And the Ministry of Infrastructure, who is in favor of solar farms, would say energy is the drug of Israel. One simple example of securitized discourses, the competition between them. As to the political setting, we try to see whether it makes a difference, and we differentiated between explicit and implicit securitization, and these are the venues, and you could see that in political venues, parliamentarian and national planning councils, the language of securitization would be more blunt. If you compare it to a technical committee, what are we securitizing? Can we identify a genuine threat? So you could see the results for climate security, energy, ecology, food to discharge. What is quite common to all of those, that in many of them, most of them, there was no genuine threat. It's a buzzword, they're using it to get attention. There is no eminent issue that they are trying to securitize. Let me skip this one. Then we try to build a security competition index that would reflect the clash between securities. One is very intense clash, 0 no clash. This is the timeline, and you can see that the competition does change a long time, and there's a difference between, again, political venues where the competition may be more intense, and technical ones, but we could not see any trend. Then we were hoping that the statistics would show us that the explanatory variables that we identified, gas discoveries, regulatory events, and geopolitical ones, would be able to explain the security competition index. None of them came up statistically significant, which is a big shame for us. But that's what there is. We could not explain the trends in security competition index. And the third case study, I will go over it very quickly, because we started it half a year ago, and by that time we are more mature to deal with security. We are analyzing the Israeli-Palestinian water negotiations, 50 protocols that document a certain negotiation event hosted by Condoleezza Rice. All protocols are on the internet. They were leaked by Al Jazeera. And we identified 38 cases that an issue had to be discussed. And you could see that in 40% of them, we could classify them to either fully securitized or partial securitized. By that time, we got the indicators straight, hopefully. And these are the indicators that we use to differentiate between fully and partial securitization, whether there is a reference object, a use of speech acts, point of no return, whether we cross a certain, probably physical threshold that if we cross it, the hydrological conditions would become irreversible. Is there a way out or a way to maintain securitization and quite often reliable water supply, and whether the audience, Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans accept the threat. Some stuff that got out. You could see that for the Palestinians, in many cases, their concerns are concerns issues of land, sovereignty. For the Israelis, in some cases, their concern is human safety, like the case of missiles and water and Gaza. Is water primary or secondary? Secondary is centrality, which is an indication for securitization. And as you can see, in many cases, water was secondary, especially in political venues. Is it state or human security which is at the center? And as you can see, in many cases in political venues, it is state which is at the center. In non-political ones, it's the other way around. Again, not surprising. And now we are still left with the unresolved question of the implications of securitization. 5 minutes. We took even less. Unfortunately, none of our data sets fits or is built in a way that we can answer that question. Is it good or bad? But just to give you an idea that it's not black and white, that it is not necessarily negative to securitize the discourse. It can become an example of maybe a negative implication, again, from the Israeli-Palestinian water negotiation, statement made by the Israelis, we can reach, and actually it could also be made by the Palestinians. When we reach an understanding about borders and land, then it will become easier for us to talk about water. So again, water is secondary. It is linked to other issues which are more dominant and actually held hostage until we resolve the other issues. So at least from a water perspective, securitization is negative. But if we review the other example, again, the water treaty between Iran and Iraq, the motivation for the water agreement is considering the desire to restore security and mutual trust, which means that because water was securitized, because there is a connection between water and non-water issues, it created a window of opportunity for signing a water agreement. So again, from a water perspective, we can argue that it is positive. So I can't give you an answer about that. Probably we need a different methodology, focus groups, scenarios, measuring the public or response to it. I don't know how to do it, but protocols would not tell us on the implications of security. It would mostly tell us how a securitized discourse is being constructed. That's it.